In the previous lesson, we got our little invoice application here up and running. We're able to see it actually functioning where we're actually using data binding as opposed to messing around with the code behind file in order to further separate our interface from our functionality using this whole concept of an MVVM pattern, or the model view model. Then we ended off that particular lesson with kind of starting to talk about this button guy down here and how are we going to handle the actual paying of this invoice. Well, and I mentioned we could actually, double click on the pay button on the interface, which would ultimately generate for us a little click event handler here within our XAML page, and that would ultimately create in our code behind file this little event handler where we could wire up some code and do some handling of that click event, and then change the is paid to true and maybe disable that button. But ultimately that's going to be bad practice, especially when you're trying to follow this MVVM pattern. Remember, we want to keep our interface and our logic as separate as possible, and in this case we're actually trying to keep as much out of our code behind file as possible. So yes, we did wire up a little bit of sample data in here, but really all you really ever want to have in here is maybe the creation of a view model and the setting of the data context, and that's really it. So this whole event handler situation here is bad practice. So we're actually going to get rid of this because we don't want to do this, and I'm going to introduce you to a way around all of this, and that's using the concept of commands. Now, a command is really a simple concept that we're going to use to be able to bind some XAML similarly to how we've done in our example here where we've used this binding, but now instead of binding properties, we actually want to bind actions, and that's where this whole concept of a command is going to come from. So we're going to save these changes here, and ultimately where we want that functionality to live that's going to execute that command is in our view model. So once again, when you're following MVVM, your view model is where you want to contain all of the functionality and the information that you want to appear on your view. This is where it's going to lie. So it would only stand to reason that when we're using this command model, that we want our command to ultimately be within our view model so that we can bind to it. So let's take a look at what a command actually looks like. So if I were to open up my Solution Explorer, I'm actually going to once again create another folder, and you can really put this wherever you want, but I just tend to have to put them in a new folder, so I'll call this commands, because you could ultimately have a number of commands, which is possible to actually reuse if you'd like, depending on how you structure your actual commands. So I'm going to create a new class file in here, and this one I'm simply going to call the pay command. Now, how do you associate a particular class with being a command? And the way that you do that is by seeing that it implements the iCommand interface. So as you see here, we'll go ahead and implement the members on this, and we have three things that kind of start to stare at us. We have the canExecute method, which returns a Boolean. We have an execute method, which returns nothing. And then we have this canExecute changed event here that ultimately can be raised to say whether or not the value associated with this canExecute has changed, which ultimately is going to say that anybody that is bound to this command is going to re-execute this method to see whether or not this particular command is executable or not. So let's go ahead and walk through a simple example here. So if I were to come back and look at my main page.xaml, so ultimately I want to keep this as simple as possible. What I would like to happen is to, once I click on this pay button, really all I'm concerned about at this point is I want to set the is paid value here within this text block to be false, or to be true, excuse me, and I want this pay button to be disabled so I can't click on it anymore, so I'm not getting a bunch of extra clicks. So I just want to do those two very simple things to show you an example of this command idea. So I'm going to come back into my command. Now ultimately what I want to be able to do is I want to go into my view model, and I want to be able to create a very similar structure to what I've been doing here before. So all I really want to do is I want to have a public version of an iCommand, and we'll call this the pay command. And all I really want to do is when I actually ask for this command, I want to return a new instance of my pay command, and I'm going to have all of the functionality that's required to determine whether or not this command can execute, or to actually execute it, I want it all to be contained within here. So within my view model, I'm simply going to have a getter and a setter here to keep this as simple as possible. But what I'm going to have to do is, if I'm going to follow that model, I'm going to have to pass something into it. I'm going to have to maybe initialize this pay command with something so that it knows what it has to do and whether or not if it can do it. So within my pay command here, that means I'm going to have to pass something in here that can determine whether or not it can execute or what to execute from the outside world. So let's go ahead and start to create a constructor. So we'll say, when I create this particular command, I want to tell it what it's going to do if it needs to be enabled. So remember, we're not returning anything from this execute method. So ultimately, I want to pass some functionality in. So I'm actually going to pass in a delegate in the form of an action, which is really just a delegate that doesn't really return anything. So I'm going to pass in an action, and this is going to be called execute. So this is what's actually going to happen when this command executes. And then also I'm going to need something that's going to allow this command to know whether or not it actually can execute. And if you recall, in a similar fashion, we can do the same thing with a delegate. But in this case, we need to return something. So we're going to have to use a function which is going to return a Boolean, and we're going to say that this is going to be can execute. So this is a very simplified example. You can obviously get as deep and detailed into this as you'd like, but this is merely to show you how this is going to work in a very simplistic way. So we're going to have to hang on to those values. So we're going to create a private variable here that's going to be an action, and we'll call this underscore execute. And then we'll have private, and we'll have a function here that returns a Boolean that's going to be can execute. So pretty simple concepts here. So we'll go ahead and save these or initialize these within the constructor. Underscore execute equal to execute. Underscore can execute equal to can execute. So there we have it. So now what we're going to do is, anytime that anything is bound to this command and it calls the can execute method, all we want to do in this case is return whatever the result is from our can execute delegate that was passed in. So that's pretty simple. And then the execute, we are merely going to then call our execute method like this. So that seems fairly straightforward, and I'm going to show you this in an example of this once we get this wired up, but this isn't going to work exactly like you may think it would. So let's just finish this example and we'll come back to a problem that this is going to cause. So if we come back into our view model, and we have this all wired up now, so now I can come in and say, in my constructor, when I have my pay command, I am going to initialize this to a new instance of my pay command, and now I can tell it what I want it to do once it's actually executed. In this case, all I really want it to do is I want it to set the isPaid property equal to true. So that's a fairly simple idea. So, and as you can see, we have this isPaid. We have a setter here, and it's going to check to see that if isPaid is equal to the same value, it's going to return. Otherwise, it's going to set it and then raise this onProperty changed event. So that means that any control within our UI that's bound to this isPaid property will realize that something has changed if this setter actually fires, and then ultimately we would want to see that show up on the UI. So that's what we're trying to do by just setting this isPaid property equal to true. Now we also have to give it something to be able to determine whether or not that this can actually be executed. And in this case, we're going to say if the invoice is not paid. So if the invoice property is set to false, then this is going to be enabled. So you can click on it, and then if you click on it, we want this isPaid to be set to true, and then ultimately the pay command can execute should return false at that point. So we'll go ahead and save that. So now the only thing we're left to do is to go back into our UI and then actually bind this button to our new command. And the way that we do that is quite simple. We merely come into our button. It has a command attribute, and we're going to use our binding syntax just like we've done in the previous examples to actually set that. So we're going to say the binding is going to be set to our pay command. And that's all we have to do. It's very similarly to how we set the binding to is paid or to amount. So let's go ahead and save this. And we're going to hit F5 to run it. And we'll have our application come back up here. And as you can see, just as we had before, we have our amount value here. So we can change this if we want. Then we can see that our is paid is set to false. And now we have our pay button. So ultimately what I want to do is I want to click this pay button, have this is paid set to true, and the pay button itself become disabled. So if I were to click on this button, well, I see that our is true now is, or our is paid is now set to true, which is great, but I can still click on this button, which in our case isn't really a big problem. But if in a scenario where there's more going on in the background, so that every time I click that button, maybe network calls are being fired off, or services are being talked to, or something like that, that is bad. So why is this happening? Well, the problem here, if I were to stop debugging, is that within our pay command, we are calling our execute method. So when I click on that button, this execute method is being fired, and we're ultimately executing whatever we told this command to do. And if you recall, within our view model, that's merely setting the is paid property to true, which is changing the value here and raising the on property change. So that's how we're getting the is paid on the UI to change. But the problem is the button is still enabled. So the problem there is that when we first created this instance of the command, we set the whether or not it's enabled to be equal to this property. But we're not using any sort of binding within our code to watch this property here to see that it has actually changed. This is only firing by things that have actually subscribed to this particular on property changed event, and which is being raised up through our XAML file here. So what we want to do is we want to do something as crude as it may be, or as simplistic as it may be in this example, is we want to tell our UI that after we click this button, we want it to reevaluate whether or not that particular button or command is enabled. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to force the hand here a little bit to actually have our application reevaluate this can execute method. And the way we're going to do that is by saying, when this actually executes, we're going to execute our action. And once it's completed, we're going to say can execute has changed, and we're going to say the object sender is this, and we're going to pass new event args, just as simple as that. So now every time this is executed, we're actually going to force the value of can execute to be reevaluated. So let's go ahead back into our example here, and we'll hit F5 to rerun our application. And as this comes up, we now have $5, is paid is false, pay is enabled. And now I'm going to click on my button. And as you can see here, my is paid value has changed to true, and my pay button is now disabled. Now, once again, as I said before, this isn't exactly best practice. This is just to show you how this is going to work. Now, you're obviously going to probably want to get a little bit more sophisticated with this, as this may not always be the case, and you may have some other business logic that's going to depend on some other outside properties or other outside aspects. So this is just one way to implement this command pattern. So you can start to decouple the concept of actions or events or functionality when people do something with your UI from the actual logic. And that's where all this command concept comes from.